Something shifted before your feet ever touched the floor today. And if you paused for even a moment, you may have realized the feeling arrived before a single thought had the chance to explain it. It was not tied to bad news, a difficult conversation, or any obvious reason. Instead, it settled quietly inside you as though an invisible hand had placed an unfamiliar weight across your chest while you slept. The morning carried a seriousness that seemed larger than the ordinary rhythm of another day. Every movement demanded slightly more from you. Every routine task seemed wrapped in an unseen resistance. You were not necessarily overwhelmed, frightened, or even unhappy. What made this experience so unsettling was that you could not easily give it a name. It simply existed, steady and undeniable, as if the atmosphere itself had become denser overnight. Chosen one, this is the second transmission within the Lion's Gate sequence, and before we continue any further, there is one truth you need to hold firmly. Nothing about what you are experiencing this morning is accidental. It is not evidence that you have lost your balance, nor is it proof that something inside you has broken. What you are sensing is the living expression of a very specific astrological alignment taking form within your emotional and physical body, because on August 4th, the Moon has entered an exact conjunction with Saturn. Whenever the Moon rests directly upon Saturn, the gravity that Saturn constantly carries is no longer experienced as an abstract spiritual principle. It becomes tangible. It moves from the language of astrology into the language of the body. The pressure becomes something your chest recognizes. Your emotions begin carrying a density that feels undeniably real. Before this moment, yesterday's transmission introduced an essential foundation, and what you learned there now becomes even more significant. You were told that before August 8th arrives, there are 3 distinct burdens that must be released, or the Lion's Gate portal closes from within rather than from outside circumstances. Since Saturn entered retrograde on July 27th, it has been quietly reviewing those hidden structures inside your life without announcing that the examination had already begun. It has been inspecting the strength of everything you have built beneath the surface, preparing you before the Lion's Gate opens and magnifies whatever remains standing when that doorway activates. Yesterday identified those 3 categories that Saturn has been examining. Today, however, the Moon has reached Saturn itself, and the first of those releases has moved beyond the stage of choice. Saturn is pressing directly against it now. That pressure may be living inside your chest. It may be hiding inside the unusual heaviness of your breathing. It may be the unexplained seriousness that greeted you the instant your eyes opened this morning. Whether you believed yourself prepared or completely caught off guard, the deeper evaluation is already underway. If today happens to be your first encounter with this sequence and you did not experience yesterday's message, do not assume you have fallen behind. This guidance was designed so each transmission can stand firmly on its own. In many ways, today's message is the most physical and grounded point in the entire progression, because the Moon-Saturn conjunction does not require belief or preparation to be experienced. Your body is already participating in it regardless of whether you have followed every step leading here. Begin with what you feel today. The remaining pieces will naturally reveal themselves as the days continue unfolding. Before exploring what is taking place across the sky and why the next 4 days hold unusual importance, it is essential to recognize what this conjunction has already awakened inside you, because awareness itself marks the first stage of transformation. If you noticed that your emotional landscape felt strangely flat this morning without any event explaining why, if the day opened with an unfamiliar seriousness that quietly colored everything around you, that is exactly how the Moon-Saturn conjunction expresses itself. Saturn governs responsibility, structure, consequence, weight, and karmic accountability. It does not concern itself with fantasy, effortless optimism, endless expansion, or comforting possibilities. Saturn focuses on reality. It reveals what has been constructed with integrity and what still contains hidden weaknesses. As the Moon moves directly across Saturn today, your emotional body becomes saturated with everything Saturn has been carrying internally since beginning its retrograde journey on July 27. Perhaps you found yourself resisting the simple act of beginning your day. Maybe getting out of bed required more determination than usual. Maybe a part of you wanted to remain completely still rather than stepping into today's responsibilities. That hesitation is not evidence of laziness. It is your nervous system instinctively recognizing the tremendous weight Saturn is highlighting and asking for one quiet moment before carrying that burden forward into movement. If you sensed emotional restriction today, if unresolved relationships, unfinished conversations, uncertain circumstances, or promises that never fully materialized suddenly felt closer than they have in weeks, you are witnessing Saturn's retrograde influence expressing itself through the moon's emotional amplification. During retrograde, Saturn rarely concentrates on changing your outer circumstances. Instead, it examines the foundation beneath your identity. It asks what remains solid when no one else is watching. Today, that invisible examination leaves visible sensations throughout your body. You may notice it resting across your shoulders, tightening your chest, or subtly changing the rhythm of your breathing. Perhaps another unusual experience appeared this morning, an intensified awareness of time itself. You may have felt as though something important has waited too long, as though a responsibility, a decision, or an overdue truth has quietly followed you until this exact day. That awareness reflects one of Saturn's deepest functions. Saturn governs your relationship with time. It reveals the distance between your present reality and the place you believed you would have reached by now. Under today's conjunction, that realization becomes remarkably vivid, almost impossible to ignore. If your dreams carried unusual emotional density last night, if you woke feeling as though sleep had delivered something meaningful without revealing its full message, if the boundary between dreaming and waking felt unusually delicate, this alignment often produces precisely those experiences. Saturn oversees unresolved psychological patterns and accumulated karmic material. The moon governs dreams, memory, emotion, and the unconscious landscape. With both occupying the same celestial space today, they perform their work simultaneously, allowing buried material to rise toward conscious awareness. Maybe you also notice a quiet realization emerging today about one area of your life that has not been functioning the way you have convinced yourself it has. Perhaps a truth that remains suppressed for many weeks or even months suddenly began pushing upward with unmistakable persistence. That movement reflects the natural progression of Saturn's retrograde process reaching another important stage. Retrograde Saturn directs its examination inward, and today the moon has opened a direct emotional pathway into that internal review. Beneath every sensation, every pause, every unexpected heaviness, there may also be another feeling that refuses to disappear, the quiet certainty that today is asking something specific from you. A particular honesty about one part of your life that can no longer remain hidden beneath distraction or avoidance. If that impression has followed you throughout the day, trust that it belongs here. It represents the very purpose of this conjunction within the larger sequence unfolding throughout this month. It also explains why understanding today's deeper meaning matters before you simply force yourself through the heaviness and continue pretending nothing significant is taking place. None of these experiences should be mistaken for punishment. Hold on to that truth because Saturn's reputation is often misunderstood. Many imagine Saturn as a force that creates hardship simply for the sake of suffering, as though difficult mornings exist because the universe enjoys placing obstacles in your path. That interpretation misses Saturn's true nature entirely. Saturn is extraordinarily precise. It operates with intention rather than cruelty, and most people only recognize the wisdom of its methods after enough time has passed to reveal why every difficult moment mattered. This morning is not about unnecessary struggle. Saturn is performing careful quality control. During these 4 days leading toward August 8th, that inspection carries extraordinary urgency because of everything that date represents within the Lion's Gate sequence. To understand why today's conjunction feels so different from an ordinary meeting between the Moon and Saturn, you must first understand the larger astronomical context surrounding it. Since July 27th, Saturn has been traveling in retrograde, meaning that from Earth's perspective it appears to move backward through the zodiac, and that apparent reversal changes the entire emotional character of what you are experiencing today. Many people misunderstand what retrograde motion truly represents, assuming it signals that a planet has somehow lost its proper course. In reality, nothing has gone wrong with Saturn at all. The phenomenon exists because of the changing relationship between Earth's orbit and Saturn's own movement, creating the appearance that Saturn is traveling backward across the zodiac. Although the motion is only apparent, the energetic implications are remarkably consistent. and they become impossible to ignore once you understand how Saturn operates in each phase of its journey. When Saturn moves direct, its attention is aimed outward. It examines the visible framework of your life, your commitments, your responsibilities, the promises you have made, the structures you depend upon, and the external systems supporting your everyday existence. It quietly applies pressure until the truth reveals itself. Whatever has been built with genuine integrity remains standing. Whatever has only looked stable begins revealing fractures that were always present beneath the surface. Direct Saturn functions like an engineer inspecting the foundation of a bridge before allowing heavier traffic to cross. The inspection focuses on what exists outside of you. Retrograde Saturn shifts the entire examination inward. Instead of questioning your external achievements, it begins asking a far more intimate question. What exists beneath the version of yourself that the world recognizes? Suddenly, the focus moves away from careers, schedules, obligations, and visible accomplishments, turning instead toward the unseen architecture supporting your identity. It begins illuminating beliefs that have survived simply because no one challenged them, identities that have become habitual performances instead of authentic expressions, emotional coping strategies that have kept old wounds organized instead of truly healed, and deeply familiar patterns that are blended so completely into daily life that you stop recognizing them as patterns at all. This is exactly why today's experience feels fundamentally different from encountering an external obstacle. Nothing obvious has necessarily changed around you. There may be no crisis demanding immediate attention, no dramatic conflict requiring resolution, and yet the emotional gravity remains impossible to dismiss. The source is not outside your circumstances. It rises from within, because Saturn has been conducting its retrograde review since July 27th, and today's exact conjunction with the Moon allows you to consciously experience what Saturn has quietly been evaluating during all this time. The examination has never been about your public image. It has always been about the deeper framework that determines who you become when appearances disappear. Another important distinction between direct Saturn and retrograde Saturn involves their relationship with the past. When Saturn moves backward through the zodiac, it repeatedly draws unfinished material toward the surface. Memories, recurring emotional responses, familiar disappointments, long-forgotten insecurities, or old relational dynamics may suddenly seem surprisingly relevant again. This is not happening because the past is attempting to reclaim your future. It is happening because Saturn wants you to recognize the repeating design rather than becoming distracted by the latest situation expressing it. Instead of asking why this particular event feels difficult, Saturn invites you to notice how many times the same emotional blueprint has quietly repeated throughout different chapters of your life. The situation changes. The underlying pattern often does not. That recognition marks the beginning of genuine transformation, because once the pattern becomes visible, it can finally be addressed instead of endlessly reenacted. The Moon plays a critical role in making this entire process emotionally tangible. Roughly every 27 days, the Moon travels across the zodiac, forming conjunctions with each planet along its path. Whenever this occurs, the Moon temporarily amplifies the qualities governed by the planet it encounters, allowing those themes to move directly into your emotional awareness. Most of these conjunctions pass almost unnoticed. Mercury may subtly sharpen your conversations or make your thoughts feel more active. Venus may briefly soften your emotional atmosphere or increase your appreciation for beauty and connection. Jupiter may create a temporary feeling that possibilities are expanding just beyond the horizon. These influences are often delicate enough to pass unnoticed unless you are paying careful attention. Saturn behaves very differently. Saturn governs weight, discipline, responsibility, consequence, structure, and karmic accountability. None of those qualities arrive quietly when magnified through the emotional body. They possess substance. They occupy space within your awareness. When the Moon joins Saturn, the emotional system begins carrying the accumulated gravity of everything Saturn represents all at once. Nearly everyone with even a modest awareness of their inner experience notices this shift because the sensation is remarkably physical. The heaviness greeting you this morning existed long before your conscious mind found words to describe it. That feeling is not imagined. It is the unmistakable signature of today's conjunction expressing itself exactly as it is designed to. Yet the retrograde condition makes today's alignment even more significant, and understanding that context allows everything else to fall naturally into place. Before considering the larger sequence unfolding this week, it is important to recognize the simple mechanics operating beneath today's experience. During direct motion, Saturn evaluates external construction. During retrograde motion, the exact same force turns inward, examining the invisible architecture supporting your identity. It asks who remains when achievements, routines, titles, expectations, and familiar roles are temporarily stripped away. What part of you continues standing when nothing external is available to define your worth? Which beliefs genuinely belong to you, and which ones have survived only because they have never been honestly questioned? Which emotional habits represent authentic healing and which merely organize unresolved pain into manageable routines? Which identities express your deepest truth and which have quietly become performances repeated so often that they now feel indistinguishable from reality? Today's conjunction is not demanding immediate changes within your external world. Instead, it is illuminating the internal framework that will eventually determine every external decision you make. Because the Moon now provides Saturn with a direct emotional pathway, these previously hidden structures rise into conscious awareness, where they can no longer remain invisible. This is precisely why today's timing matters so profoundly. August 4th is not an arbitrary point on the calendar. It arrives exactly 4 days before the Lion's Gate opens on August 8th, and that sequence carries extraordinary significance. Saturn's exact conjunction with the Moon functions as a final inspection before the threshold is crossed. The timing is deliberate because Saturn serves as the guardian standing before the gate itself. Every year, August 8th becomes one of the most widely discussed moments within modern astrology, and while the surrounding conversation often becomes exaggerated, the underlying symbolism possesses genuine depth. On this date, the Sun in Leo aligns with the fixed star Sirius, a celestial body honored across numerous ancient traditions as a symbol of illumination, abundance, and expanded spiritual awareness. During the annual 8-8 alignment, Sirius rises alongside the Sun in the morning sky, while the repeating energy of the number 8 has long been associated with infinity, abundance, and enduring cycles of creation. For this reason, many regard August 8th as one of the most intentionally powerful periods for manifestation throughout the spiritual calendar. Whatever crosses the threshold of consciousness during this portal tends to carry unusual momentum into the months ahead. That reality explains why Saturn's work today is so essential. Saturn represents both the master architect and the uncompromising auditor of cosmic law. It does not permit unstable structures to pass forward without revealing their weaknesses first. Since entering retrograde on July 27th, Saturn has quietly examined everything you continue carrying within yourself. Today's conjunction allows you to experience the results of that examination emotionally, instead of merely understanding them intellectually. 3 distinct forms of weight stand at the center of Saturn's evaluation. The first is structural weight. The second is emotional weight. The third is identity weight. Although each category expresses itself differently, all 3 determine what accompanies you through the Lion's Gate. If they remain unexamined and unreleased before August 8th, they either become obstacles preventing clear passage, or they expand dramatically as the portal amplifies whatever continues traveling with you. The first category, structural weight, is often the easiest to recognize because it appears through the visible arrangements shaping your everyday life. Structural weight includes commitments, obligations, relationships, circumstances, and agreements that have quietly exceeded their natural lifespan while continuing to demand your energy. Perhaps you remain invested because so much time, effort, or emotion has already been poured into maintaining them. Perhaps ending them would require an uncomfortable conversation you have postponed repeatedly. Perhaps you continue hoping circumstances will somehow improve without requiring difficult decisions from you. Saturn is not interested in the explanations supporting your continued attachment. Saturn asks only one question: can the structure genuinely support itself, or have you become the invisible force holding it together? Many people unknowingly spend years supplying strength to relationships, responsibilities, or arrangements that lost their own integrity long ago, allowing them to appear functional only because of continuous personal sacrifice. That hidden compensation is one of the clearest expressions of structural weight. And today, Saturn gently but unmistakably brings it into the light before the lion's gate, asks you to decide what truly deserves to accompany you across the threshold. There are certain burdens that remain almost invisible for as long as you continue supplying them with your own strength. From the outside, they appear stable, functional, even successful. Yet the moment you stop supporting them, their true condition immediately becomes impossible to hide. That is the essence of structural weight. It survives not because it possesses genuine integrity, but because your energy has been compensating for weaknesses that should have revealed themselves long ago. Saturn's attention today is fixed on these hidden imbalances, inviting you to look honestly at the places where your effort has quietly become the only thing preventing collapse. Think about how this unfolds across the areas of life that shape your everyday experience. Within relationships, structural weight often appears so gradually that you hardly notice the transition. What once felt alive, reciprocal, and deeply nourishing slowly transforms into something maintained through habit rather than authentic connection. Conversations continue, routines remain intact, obligations are fulfilled, yet somewhere beneath the surface the relationship has shifted from shared presence into careful performance. A friendship may now revolve around checking responsibilities off an invisible list instead of naturally exchanging care and understanding. A romantic partnership may continue functioning, yet emotional closeness has quietly been replaced by managing schedules, solving practical problems, and preserving appearances. A professional relationship may require more emotional navigation than meaningful collaboration, leaving you exhausted before any actual work has even begun. Saturn is not asking whether these relationships once brought value into your life. It already knows they did. The question presented today is far more immediate. Does the relationship, in its present form, genuinely return enough life, trust, and nourishment to justify the energy it continually asks from you? That is the structural examination taking place beneath everything you are feeling. The same principle extends naturally into your work, your calling, and your sense of purpose. Structural weight in this part of life rarely announces itself through dramatic failure. Instead, it develops almost silently. You continue moving toward a goal because you committed yourself to it long ago, not because you have consciously chosen it again with the person you have become today. Momentum quietly replaces alignment. Habit disguises itself as conviction. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and eventually you realize you have been traveling in the same direction simply because you never paused long enough to ask whether your heart still wished to go there. Saturn retrograde interrupts that automatic movement. It increases the emotional cost of continuing without reflection until remaining on the same path feels heavier than stopping to reconsider it. That growing pressure is not meant to discourage your progress. It exists to create the space necessary for an honest question. Are you still walking towards something meaningful, or are you simply continuing because stopping feels unfamiliar? Structural weight also hides inside personal habits and emotional routines. Some practices genuinely protected you during seasons when survival required extraordinary resilience. Certain coping strategies were not mistakes. They were intelligent responses to circumstances that demanded them. Yet life changes, while survival strategies often remain long after the danger has disappeared. Something that once preserved your stability may now quietly limit your freedom. Familiarity convinces you that keeping it is safer than questioning it. Saturn has little interest in preserving what has simply become comfortable. It asks whether the strategy continues serving your present reality, or whether it has become another invisible burden that your current life no longer requires. If one particular habit immediately came to mind before you consciously searched for it, pay attention to that reaction. That immediate recognition is not coincidence. It is Saturn's retrograde examination, reaching your conscious awareness through today's conjunction with the Moon. The answer has likely existed inside you for quite some time. What Saturn presses upon today is not your ability to identify it. It is your willingness to stop disguising it, to stop maintaining the distance between what it truly is and the story you have continued telling yourself about it. Consider what happens if this structural weight remains untouched as August 8th approaches. The Lion's Gate does not erase what accompanies you through it. Its defining quality is amplification. Whatever enters that portal expands according to its existing nature. If an unstable structure crosses the threshold without honest examination, the instability does not disappear afterward. It becomes more obvious. The imbalance demands greater attention. The effort required to compensate grows even larger. Anything for which you are currently over-functioning will likely require even more of your energy after August 10th if it remains unexamined before the gate opens. This is not the universe delivering punishment. It is simply the natural consequence of amplification. Expansion does not distinguish between what feels pleasant and what feels difficult. It magnifies whatever already exists. Yet there is encouraging truth hidden within Saturn's reputation that people often overlook. Carrying the anticipation of honesty is usually far heavier than living inside honesty itself. The fear of acknowledging reality often weighs more than reality ever will. Whatever truth you hesitate to face this morning is unlikely to wound you as deeply as the continuous effort required to avoid seeing it clearly. Saturn's gift rarely arrives wrapped in comfort, but clarity itself becomes an extraordinary form of liberation once you allow yourself to receive it. Beyond structural weight lies the second category now emerging into awareness, emotional weight, and this layer requires a completely different kind of courage. Structural weight concerns what you continue carrying through action. Emotional weight concerns what you continue carrying through silence. It lives inside feelings that have never been fully admitted, emotions carefully managed instead of honestly experienced. As this lunar cycle moves toward its last quarter moon on August 6th, only 2 days away, the emotional journey of the past 4 weeks naturally approaches its release phase. Every lunar cycle invites beginnings, development, culmination, and eventual letting go. Throughout these recent weeks, countless emotional experiences may have accumulated beneath the surface. Grief, disappointment, resentment, frustration, quiet sadness, unresolved anger, or subtle emotional exhaustion may all have entered your field without receiving the attention they truly required. None of those feelings disappear simply because they remain unspoken. They settle quietly inside your emotional landscape, gradually becoming additional weight. Today's conjunction allows Saturn to press directly upon everything still waiting beneath the surface while the moon magnifies your awareness of it. This combination creates the unmistakable emotional heaviness so many people experience during a Moon-Saturn conjunction. Unprocessed emotion rarely stays isolated from the rest of your experience. Instead, it colors your entire perception. It influences every conversation, every ordinary task, every moment of silence, creating an atmosphere that feels strangely heavy without pointing toward any obvious cause. That is why the morning carried unusual seriousness before anything happened to justify it. Nothing external needed to change because something internal had already been waiting for recognition. Saturn is no longer allowing those hidden emotions to remain buried beneath daily activity. One question deserves your full attention today. What grief from this past month have you quietly refused to acknowledge? Grief reaches far beyond losing another person. Sometimes grief appears when a future you imagined slowly disappears. Sometimes it arrives after expectations dissolve without warning. Sometimes it follows the transformation of a relationship you believed would remain unchanged. Sometimes it emerges when a meaningful opportunity quietly closes, when a path reveals itself as leading nowhere, or when a cherished hope slowly fades into uncertainty. Every one of those experiences carries genuine loss. Everyone deserves emotional recognition. When grief is denied that opportunity, it does not vanish. It settles into the emotional body as additional weight. Ask yourself another equally important question. Which disappointment have you renamed acceptance before allowing yourself to truly experience what was lost? Within many spiritual communities and personal growth traditions, there exists a subtle temptation to transform painful experiences into lessons almost immediately. Certainly, many hardships eventually reveal valuable wisdom. Many disappointments truly become meaningful redirections with time, yet wisdom cannot replace feeling. When the lesson is embraced before the emotion has been lived, understanding becomes emotional avoidance rather than healing. If you quickly convinced yourself that a painful ending was simply divine redirection while quietly suppressing the grief underneath, that unresolved sorrow still occupies space within your emotional field today. Saturn now asks you to recognize it honestly before expecting yourself to move beyond it. Finally, consider whether resentment has been hidden beneath more socially acceptable names. Perhaps you called it patience. Perhaps you described it as compassion, maturity, understanding, perspective, or choosing the higher path. Those qualities are deeply valuable, and they may genuinely reflect who you are. Yet even authentic kindness can occasionally become a disguise that prevents legitimate anger from being acknowledged. If someone genuinely hurt you during this lunar cycle, and you responded with remarkable grace, there may still be anger quietly waiting underneath that grace, asking only to be recognized rather than denied. Saturn is not encouraging destructive expression. It is inviting truthful recognition. An emotion, acknowledged honestly, gains the freedom to move through you. An emotion repeatedly renamed remains trapped within you. This distinction becomes especially important before August 8th. Whatever emotional landscape crosses the Lion's Gate remains subject to the portal's amplifying influence. Emotional burdens that remain unexamined do not dissolve after crossing the threshold. They become louder. Managed grief becomes heavier. Suppressed disappointment becomes more persistent. Unrecognized anger presses more firmly against the boundaries holding it back. The portal magnifies the emotional field exactly as it exists, making today's willingness to acknowledge what is already present one of the most important preparations you can make before stepping into what comes next. Many people walk away from the Lion's Gate or similar energetic alignments, believing the experience somehow made everything heavier instead of lighter. They assume the portal itself created discomfort, when in truth something much more precise is taking place. These periods of amplification do not manufacture emotional weight, they simply reveal and enlarge whatever has already been living beneath the surface. The energy does not respond to the polished version of yourself that you have carefully maintained. It responds to the field that actually exists underneath appearances. That is why today asks for honesty instead of resistance. If you allow yourself to fully experience the emotional density that greeted you this morning, if you stop trying to shrink it into something more acceptable or easier to manage, Saturn completes its work with greater efficiency. The process is not prolonged because Saturn enjoys testing you. It becomes prolonged only when energy is divided between what you genuinely feel and what you are willing to admit that you feel. Every effort spent maintaining that separation quietly extends the examination. Every moment of honest recognition allows the pressure to begin moving instead of remaining trapped inside you. Beyond structural weight and emotional weight lies the most subtle layer of all, identity weight, and this is the dimension Saturn retrograde is uniquely qualified to expose because it hides more successfully than the others. Identity weight is not simply a habit or an emotion. It is the version of yourself that continues living long after the circumstances that created it have disappeared. It is the role you accepted because life demanded it at one particular chapter. It may have solved a real problem. It may have earned admiration. It may even have become one of the qualities people know you for today. Yet Saturn asks a different question. If you were meeting your current life for the very first time, would you consciously choose this identity again? Or are you simply continuing to wear it because you have worn it for so long that removing it feels impossible? Every person carries identities that once served an important purpose. There is the dependable one who quietly carries responsibilities no one else notices. There is the endlessly patient one who absorbs discomfort so others can remain comfortable. There is the fiercely independent one who refuses to ask for support, even when exhaustion has become overwhelming. There is the responsible one who constantly protects everyone else from becoming burden. There is the strong one whose own struggles remain permanently hidden behind calm composure. None of these identities are inherently unhealthy. Many were formed through genuine courage and remarkable resilience. Some may still reflect authentic parts of who you are today. Saturn is not attempting to erase them. Instead, it asks whether they remain conscious choices flowing from your present self, or whether they continue operating automatically through expectation, habit, and momentum, without ever being reconsidered. Saturn retrograde makes that question almost impossible to avoid because it quietly removes the external distractions that normally keep identity weight concealed. During periods when life feels productive, busy, and externally successful, the fatigue created by sustaining an identity blends into the general pace of living. You assume you are simply tired because life requires so much from you. Yet when Saturn turns retrograde, and today's conjunction with the Moon makes your emotional world unusually transparent, another truth becomes visible. The exhaustion attached to performing an identity has a remarkably distinct quality. It settles differently inside the body. It carries its own emotional texture. It cannot be confused with ordinary physical fatigue once you begin paying attention. It is important to understand that this performance does not exist because you are somehow less authentic than other people. Identity performance begins as adaptation. At one point in your life, becoming that particular version of yourself was the wisest response available. Those circumstances genuinely required that strength, that patience, that independence, or that responsibility. The difficulty appears only because your inner world has continued evolving while your outer presentation has remained frozen in an earlier chapter. Personal transformation often happens long before identity catches up. Saturn retrograde simply illuminates that delay. It gently reveals the distance between the person you have quietly become and the person you continue presenting to the world. Identity weight becomes especially difficult because it eventually feels indistinguishable from your own personality. Structural burdens are often recognizable because they involve visible commitments. Emotional burdens reveal themselves through mood and feeling. Identity weight disappears into your sense of self. You have carried it for so long that it begins feeling like the natural weight of existing rather than an additional burden layered upon your existence. Today's conjunction allows Saturn to highlight those places where the body has been carrying performed identity as though it were permanent truth. Its purpose is not to criticize you. Its purpose is to separate what genuinely belongs to you from what simply became familiar through repetition. That distinction matters profoundly before August 8th arrives. If identity weight crosses the lion's gate without examination, the portal does not magically transform it into authenticity. Instead, the energy amplifies the version of yourself that continues moving through the threshold. This idea may sound dramatic at first, yet its mechanics are remarkably straightforward. The lion's gate expands what genuinely enters it. Expansion cannot strengthen a truth that has not been brought forward. If you arrive carrying a performance instead of authentic presence, the portal amplifies the performance because that is the energy being offered. It cannot expand a deeper self that remains hidden behind roles, expectations, and carefully maintained identities. This is precisely why Saturn stands before the gate in today's sequence. Its responsibility is to remove what no longer reflects reality before amplification begins. That process rarely feels comfortable. The emotional heaviness greeting you this morning is evidence that Saturn is doing exactly what it was designed to accomplish. Every layer being exposed now allows what eventually passes through the lion's gate to belong more completely to your authentic life, instead of to a version of yourself assembled primarily for external approval. To recognize this word more clearly, it helps to understand how each category announces itself during today's conjunction. Structural weight often reveals itself through a specific part of your life that quietly consumes more energy than it returns. Rather than feeling generally exhausted, your awareness repeatedly returns to one commitment, one arrangement, one relationship, or one responsibility whose maintenance has become increasingly expensive. Perhaps you notice that optimism surrounding it has become something you consciously perform rather than genuinely experience. Perhaps you realize you have invested tremendous effort into preserving the appearance that everything continues functioning, even though part of you already knows the foundation has weakened. Saturn quietly places one unmistakable question before you today. Does this truly deserve the energy you continue giving it? If your deepest answer were no, would you possess the courage to admit that truth to yourself? Emotional weight speaks through a different language altogether. It often appears as the unexplained heaviness that arrived before the day itself began. As the hours unfold, certain conversations may feel strangely significant despite ordinary circumstances. Minor interactions may stir emotions that seem far larger than the moment deserves. Memories may unexpectedly return, carrying unresolved feelings you believed had already faded. An old wound may briefly reopen. A familiar grief may revisit your awareness, asking not for dramatic expression but simply for acknowledgement. Saturn's question beneath every emotional wave remains remarkably simple. Can you allow this feeling to exist exactly as it is instead of continuing to rename it into something easier to accept? Identity weight expresses itself through perhaps the quietest signal of all. It often appears as a subtle awareness that the person speaking, responding, working, or caring is not completely identical to the person quietly observing from within. You may notice an unusual fatigue that has little to do with physical effort. Instead, it comes from sustaining a particular way of appearing throughout the day. There may be moments when you observe your own behavior almost from outside yourself, recognizing that habit continues performing long after genuine desire has changed. Saturn places one final question into the center of your awareness. If every expectation disappeared, who would remain? If you no longer needed to become the person everyone assumed you were, what version of yourself would naturally step forward instead? None of these questions offer immediate comfort. Each one asks for patience, stillness, and a willingness to remain present longer than instinct initially prefers. The fact that all three forms of weight arrive together beneath the same Moon-Saturn conjunction explains why this morning carries such unusual emotional density. That heaviness should not be mistaken for failure. It represents the intended design of this sequence unfolding exactly as it should. Nothing has gone wrong with your week. Nothing has gone wrong with your spiritual path. Saturn is fulfilling its role with extraordinary precision on the exact morning this examination was always meant to occur, because the next 4 days require a level of honesty that cannot emerge without today's preparation. Before tomorrow's transmission continues the journey, it is important to step back and recognize the larger arc now unfolding. Everything experienced this morning belongs to a much broader movement, building steadily toward August 8th, and understanding that wider perspective allows today's discomfort to become something far more meaningful than a difficult beginning. It becomes the essential foundation for everything the rest of this month is preparing to reveal, so that today's heaviness has a context that transforms its meaning entirely. 4 days from now on, August 8th, the Lion's Gate opens. 4 days after that, on August 12th, a new moon arrives with a total solar eclipse in Leo. That eclipse is one of the most significant astronomical events of this year, a total solar eclipse in the sign that governs the soul's fullest expression, arriving in the wake of the Lion's Gate with the full amplification of that portal still active. Between August 8th and August 12th, the Sun is moving through Leo while the eclipse is building, and the eclipse itself will mark the beginning of a new 6-month cycle that will not complete until the corresponding lunar eclipse in February 2027. What this means for today is that the weight Saturn is pressing on this morning is not relevant only to the next few days. It is relevant to the next 6 months. The eclipse cycle initiated on August 12th will unfold and develop across everything that happens in your life between now and February. And what the eclipse cycle amplifies and initiates is directly related to what passes through the Lion's Gate 4 days before it. And what passes through the Lion's Gate on August 8th is shaped by exactly what is released, examined, and genuinely processed in the 4 days before it, which is today. This is not an exaggeration of today's significance. Today's Moon-Saturn conjunction, sitting 4 days before the gate and 8 days before the eclipse, is genuinely structurally important to a 6-month arc of your life. The work Saturn is doing this morning in your chest, and your mood is not small work. It is quality control for something considerably larger than an ordinary week. On August 6th, 2 days from now, 3 things happen simultaneously. The moon reaches its last quarter, the natural lunar release point. The phase designed for letting go of what the cycle has made clear is ready to leave. Venus enters Libra, shifting the territory of relationships and self-worth into its home sign, the most balanced and reciprocal expression of Venus in the entire zodiac. And the final shadow of Mercury's recent retrograde period completely clears, dissolving the last remaining communication blocks and distortions that the retrograde introduced. 3 things orienting toward clearing and release, all landing on the same day, 2 days before the gate opens. This is not coincidental sequencing. It is the natural architecture of a month designed around a major portal and a major eclipse. Tomorrow, between today and August 6th, is the Mercury dichotomy, and that is the bridge that carries what Saturn revealed today into the clarity required to actually release it. Saturn shows you the weight. Mercury dichotomy shows you the story underneath the weight, the mental pattern that has been holding the weight in place. August 6th gives you the natural release mechanics of the last quarter moon, combined with Venus's arrival in her home sign. and the clearing of the final retrograde shadow. And August 8th opens the gate. You are not being asked to do everything at once. You are being given a precise 4-day sequence of conditions, each one suited to a different part of the releasing work. Today is Saturn pressing on what is heavy. Tomorrow is Mercury showing what is holding it in place. The day after is the natural release point. And August 8th is the opening. Your only job today is to do today's work, which is to feel honestly what is heavy and to name it as what it is rather than what you have been calling it. August 8th is 4 days away. Between now and then, everything the Mayans' gate sequence has been building toward comes into place. The Moon-Saturn conjunction today is the first and heaviest gate. Tomorrow, August 5th, Mercury reaches its dichotomy, the exact halfway point between its elongation in the morning sky and its invisible conjunction with the Sun, the precise moment when Mercury is half illuminated, casting the sharpest discernment available at any point this month. That is not an accident of timing. The second release, the mental pattern, the story you have been telling yourself about why you are not ready, why you are not enough, why this particular door does not open for people like you. That story can only be seen with the clarity required to actually drop it during a Mercury dichotomy window. Tomorrow will give you that window. Today gives you the weight that makes tomorrow's clarity necessary. On August 6th, the moon reaches its last quarter, the natural lunar release point of the month, the phase specifically designed for letting go of what the cycle has made clear needs to be released. Also on August 6th, Venus moves into Libra, shifting the energy around relationships and self-worth into its home side, the most balanced and discerning expression of Venus available in the zodiac. And on August 6th, the 7th, the final shadow of Mercury's recent retrograde period completely clears, dissolving all remaining communication blocks that the retrograde created. 3 alignment points converging on the same day or two, all of them oriented toward clearing and releasing, all of them arriving between today's Saturn pressure and August 8th's portal opening. Then on August 12th, 4 days after the gate opens, the new moon arrives with a total solar eclipse in Leo. That eclipse is not relevant to today's transmission except as context, because an eclipse in the days following the Lion's Gate means that what the portal delivers on the 8th has solar eclipse amplification behind it through the eclipse on the 12th. The entire arc of this month is pointed at maximum amplification of what passes through the gate, which is precisely why Saturn today is being this thorough, this insistent, this willing to make you feel genuinely heavy on what might otherwise have been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in August. The weight you are carrying right now is being examined because what passes through the gate on August 8th matters. What you release between today and August 8th matters. Every moment of honest discomfort this morning is Saturn earning its reputation as the most demanding and the most generous of all the planets. Demanding because it refuses to let you avoid what needs to be seen, and generous because what it reveals, once seen and released, does not follow you through the gate. I want to give you something practical to do with this morning's heaviness, because understanding the mechanism of what is happening does not automatically tell you how to work with it in the actual hours of your actual day. You are not moving through this morning alone, and you are not moving through it without purpose. Saturn and the Moon are doing their specific purposeful work in your body and your mood today. And every moment of genuine honesty you bring to what they are pressing on is a moment of genuine preparation for what arrives on August 8th and amplifies through August 12th and beyond. Take the morning seriously and deliberately. Let it be genuinely heavy. Let Saturn do its job. The heaviness today is the information. It is Saturn delivering the results of the audit it has been conducting since July 27th, and trying to work around it rather than through it simply delays the examination until it arrives with more urgency. The body knows what it knows. The flatness this morning is not random. It is pointing at something specific. And the single most useful thing you can do today is allow it to point rather than redirecting it into busyness. Take a few minutes this morning or across today, wherever they become available, and sit with each of the 3 categories. Honestly, what is the specific structural weight you are aware of? The thing that is taking more than it is returning? What is the emotional weight that has been accumulating across the last lunar cycle without adequate acknowledgement? What is the identity weight, the performance of self that you are tired of sustaining? Write each one down if you can, not because writing them resolves them, but because language makes the examined thing real in a way that internal thought alone does not. Saturn is asking for honesty. An honesty that exists only as a felt sense without being put into words is easier to retreat from than honesty that has been named writing. The second thing to do with today is to connect each piece of weight you identify to what you are actually asking the Lion's Gate to amplify for you on August 8th. What do you want to call in through the portal? What shift? What expansion? What new beginning do you want the gate to initiate? Because whatever you are asking for, the structural weight, the emotional weight, and the identity weight you are carrying are all in some relationship to it. Either they are directly blocking it, or they are the reason you have not yet felt ready for it, or they are the outdated versions of things that the new thing would replace. This relationship between what you are carrying and what you are asking for is one of the most clarifying inquiries you can make today. If you want more abundance to pass through the gate, but you are carrying structural weight in a financial arrangement that is draining rather than building, that is not a coincidence. If you want deeper connection or love to pass through the gate, but you are carrying emotional weight in the form of resentment or grief that has not been fully acknowledged, that is directly relevant. If you want to step into a larger version of yourself through the gate, but you are carrying identity weight in the form of an old self-concept that no longer fits, the gate cannot expand what you refuse to release first. Saturn today is not your enemy. Saturn today is possibly the most useful force available to you across the entire month of August because it is doing the work on August 4th that makes everything from August 5th through August 12th actually land at the depth it is designed to reach. The discomfort this morning is not the price of what comes next. It is the preparation. And preparation done with genuine attention, even when it is genuinely uncomfortable, is considerably more valuable than a portal arrived at unprepared. The third thing to do with today, to let yourself feel the actual weight, rather than managing it into something more presentable. Not to amplify it or indulge it or build a story around it, but simply to stop managing it for long enough to allow it to actually be present as what it is. Saturn honored rather than bypassed moves more quickly and more keenly through what it needs to move through. The examination does not take longer when you stop resisting it. It takes longer when you continue managing the gap between what you feel and what you are admitting you feel. Give this morning its actual size. Let the heaviness be as heavy as it actually is, and then let Saturn do the specific purposeful work it has arrived to do today, so that what reaches August 8th is genuinely light enough to pass through the gate as it is, rather than as you wish it were. The third thing to do with today is to let yourself feel the actual weight rather than managing it into something more presentable. Not to amplify it, or indulge it, or build a story around it, but simply to stop managing it for long enough to allow it to actually be present as what it is. Grief that is allowed to be grief for 5 minutes moves differently than grief that is continuously managed into something more functional. The same is true for the specific quality of today's heaviness. Saturn today is not asking you to collapse under the weight. It is asking you to stop pretending the weight is not there, because the first step of releasing something is allowing yourself to actually feel its presence rather than its management. Before this transmission closes, I want to say something directly about what tomorrow holds, because today's work and tomorrow's clarity are two halves of the same process. Tomorrow, August 5th, Mercury reaches its dichotomy, the precise midpoint of its morning appearance in the sky, the moment when it is exactly half illuminated, like a half moon, but for Mercury. And this is significant because it corresponds to Mercury's sharpest discernment window. Mercury at dichotomy is the clearest Mercury gets all month. It is the moment when the mental atmosphere is most suited to seeing through fog, cutting through self-deception, and identifying the specific story or belief that has been keeping you smaller than your circumstances require. The second of the three releases is specifically a mental pattern, the story you keep telling yourself about why you are not ready, why you are not the person this particular expansion would choose, why the gate is probably not opening for people like you specifically. That story is subtle, more subtle than the structural and emotional weights, which is why it requires Mercury at its sharpest point of discernment to actually see it rather than mistake it for reality. Today, do the weight. Tomorrow gives you the clarity that makes the second release actually possible. Hold what you find today. Do not rush past today's heaviness toward tomorrow's clarity, because what Saturn is showing you today is specifically what Mercury's sharp light needs to illuminate tomorrow. The 2 days are sequential for a reason. Saturn shows you what is heavy, Mercury shows you what story is keeping it in place, and together they create the conditions for the 3 releases this sequence has been building toward, so that what you carry through the Lion's Gate on August 8th is genuinely, honestly yours. The video appearing on your screen right now is the August 5th transmission built for Mercury at dichotomy and the second and final clear window before the gate opens. It tells you what the mental pattern actually sounds like, how to recognize it in real time rather than only in retrospect, and what dropping it at Mercury's dichotomy point actually requires. Today showed you the weight. Tomorrow names the story underneath it. Both are necessary for August 8th to do what it is designed to do. Click it now before the window Mercury is offering tomorrow closes along with the day.